Everything you think you know about the map of Europe is wrong. It has always been wrong. The map you learned in school. The one with Britain sitting apart from the continent. An island nation separated from France by a thin strip of water, surrounded by the gray expanse of the North Sea. That map is not a picture of the world. It is a picture of right now. A snapshot taken at the tail end of a geological eye blink. And if you could rewind time by just 8,000 years, a period so recent that the pyramids of Egypt had not yet been imagined, you would find something that would stop you cold. No English Channel. No North Sea. No island of Britain. Instead, a vast, unbroken land stretching from the English heartland all the way to the coasts of Denmark and the Netherlands. A land of wide, slow rivers and dense ancient forests. Of marshes teeming with life and hills rising gently above the plain. A land with weather and seasons and animals and, most importantly, people. Thousands of people. Living, hunting, building fires, raising children, and burying their dead on ground that is now sitting under 150 feet of cold, dark salt water. That land had a name. And the fact that almost no one outside of specialist archaeology knows is one of the great oversights of how we tell the human story. It was called Doggerland. And right now, as you listen to these words, the remnants of that civilization are lying in the mud of the North Sea floor. Hearths, tools, bones, the physical evidence of a lost world that housed a human population for longer than the entire span of recorded history. A world that was not destroyed by war or disease or famine, but by something far older and far more patient. The Earth's own climate. This is the story of Doggerland. And if it sounds familiar, it should, because we are living through its sequel. To understand how Doggerland came to be, you have to travel back to a world almost beyond imagination. A world so different from our own that the same geography, the same coastlines, the same mountain ranges feel like the features of an alien planet. 22,000 years ago, the Earth was in the grip of the last glacial maximum, the coldest, most extreme phase of the last great ice age. And the ice was not like anything we have today. It was not the ice of Greenland or Antarctica, remote and peripheral. It was here, in what is now Scotland, a sheet of glacial ice rose to a thickness of nearly 2 miles. Over Scandinavia, it was thicker still. Across northern Europe, from the British Isles to the plains of Siberia, the land was buried under a weight of frozen water so immense that it actually compressed the Earth's crust beneath it. Look north from what would one day be the city of London, and you would have been staring at a wall of ice on the horizon. But here is the part that changes everything. All of that ice, all of that frozen water locked in glaciers and ice sheets across the northern hemisphere had to come from somewhere. And it came from the oceans. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, so much water had been pulled from the sea and locked into ice that global sea levels were not just a little lower than today. They were roughly 360 feet lower. 360 feet. Think about what that means for the geography of northwestern Europe. The shallow, relatively flat basin of what is now the North Sea, much of which sits at depths of less than 150 feet, was not a sea at all. It was land, dry land, fully exposed, stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. The floor of the English Channel, at its shallowest only about 120 feet below the modern surface, was likewise exposed. The narrow strip of water that separates Dover from Calais did not exist. You could walk from what is now southeastern England into what is now northern France without getting your feet wet. Britain was not an island. It was a peninsula, a western appendage of a continuous European landmass. And at the heart of that landmass, occupying the vast low-lying plain between what would one day be the British coast and the future coastlines of Scandinavia and the Low Countries, lay the land that would eventually earn its name, the cradle of what we now call Doggerland. In 1913, a British geologist named Clement Reid wrote a quietly revolutionary paper. In it, he proposed something that his colleagues largely found interesting but not particularly urgent. That the floor of the North Sea had once been dry land. That Britain had once been connected to Europe. That there had been, in short, a lost landscape sitting beneath the waves. He was right. But the full significance of what he was describing would take most of the rest of the century to appreciate. It was in 1998 that archaeologist Bryony Coles gave the lost land its enduring name. She called it Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, the large submerged sandbank in the middle of the North Sea that had long been known to fishermen as a rich but treacherous fishing ground. The name came from an Old Dutch word, dogger, referring to a type of fishing vessel. In choosing it, Coles was not just naming a place. She was naming a civilization. A chapter of human history that had been sitting beneath the waves, largely unread for 8,000 years. The name stuck, and slowly, as the tools of modern science caught up with the ambition of the question, Doggerland began to give up its secrets. To stand in Doggerland at the last glacial maximum, around 22,000 years ago, would have been a sobering experience. This was not yet the rich, forested landscape it would become. The warming was still thousands of years away. In its earliest form, the exposed North Sea plain was a harsh, wind-blasted environment, cold beyond anything most of us have experienced. Winters of extraordinary severity, summers brief and grudging, the sky heavy with cloud and the soil thin and unforgiving. The landscape would have resembled, in many ways, the modern tundra of Siberia or northern Canada. A vast, flat, treeless plain broken by braided rivers of meltwater running off the ice sheets to the north. Low scrub, patches of moss and lichen, the distant roar of calving glaciers carrying on the wind. And yet, even here there was life. Because life, as this planet has demonstrated over 4 billion years, finds a way. Across the frozen plain, in numbers we can barely estimate, moved the great animals of the Pleistocene. Woolly mammoths, their long curved tusks raking through the snow for the frozen grass beneath. Woolly rhinoceroses, massively built and deeply shaggy, grazing across the open ground. Cave lions, considerably larger than their modern African descendants, hunting in the cold. Giant elk, the males carrying antlers spanning up to 12 feet from tip to tip. Horses, reindeer, bison, an entire ecosystem of megafauna that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to thrive in the cold. And following the herds, as they had for tens of thousands of years, were the people. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, small bands of perhaps 15 to 30 individuals, tracking the mammoth and the horse across the tundra plain. We have only fragments of their presence in what would become Doggerland. A flint tool here, an animal bone with the marks of human butchery there. The evidence is sparse, scattered, and maddeningly incomplete. The sea that covered their campsites was not kind to the record they left behind. But they were there, moving through the cold, as their ancestors had moved for 30,000 years before them. They were the first people of the lost land, though they had no way of knowing it would one day be lost. To them, it was simply the world, the only world they had ever known. Then, slowly the world began to change. Around 14,700 years ago, the Earth tilted, in a sense, just slightly more toward the warmth. A combination of factors, shifts in the Earth's orbital parameters, changes in ocean circulation, feedbacks within the climate system itself, pushed the planet into a warming phase of startling speed and intensity. Climatologists call it the Balling-Allarod interstadial. You may not know the name, but its consequences reshaped the entire northern hemisphere. Within a few centuries, maybe less, average temperatures across Europe rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. The ice sheets began to retreat. Meltwater poured off the glaciers in rivers and floods. And across the exposed plain of what is now the North Sea, the landscape began, slowly at first, and then, with gathering momentum, to transform. The tundra greened. Grasses appeared, then shrubs, then the first pioneering trees, birch and pine, pushing northward as the cold retreated. The rivers swelled with meltwater and cut new channels across the plain. Lakes formed in depressions left by retreating ice. The air softened. The growing season lengthened. The sky, perhaps for the first time in centuries, showed blue. And the animals came. Different animals now. The cold-adapted megafauna, already under pressure from thousands of years of hunting, began to thin. The woolly mammoth retreated northward with the ice, on a journey it would not survive. In their place came the animals of the temperate forest and wetland. Red deer, aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle. Wild boar rooting through the leaf litter. Elk, smaller than their Pleistocene predecessors, but no less magnificent, wading through the new marshes. Beavers building their dams across the young rivers. The land was being remade, and the people were being remade with it. Here is a number that deserves to sit in your mind for a moment. At the height of Doggerland, approximately 8,000 years ago, at its absolute peak of habitable extent and ecological richness, this lost land was larger than the modern United Kingdom. Larger than the United Kingdom. It stretched from the eastern shores of what is now England, across an interior of rivers and forests and hills, all the way to the coasts of modern Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France. Its northern edge pushed up toward the latitude of modern Edinburgh. Its southern reaches touched the margins of what would one day be the English Channel. Its total area has been estimated at anywhere between 100,000 and 200,000 square miles, depending on which period you are measuring and how you draw the uncertain boundaries. It was not a strip of mudflat. It was not a coastal margin. It was a continent within a continent. A landscape of genuine topographic variety. The rivers of Britain, the Thames, the Great Ouse, the Humber, did not stop at the coast as they do today. They flowed on, joining the rivers of the European mainland in a vast central drainage network. The Rhine, the Meuse, the Scheldt, all converging into a great central river system that archaeologists sometimes call the UR Rhine, flowing roughly northward before emptying into the open Atlantic somewhere to the northwest. In the heart of Doggerland, that great river would have been a dominant geographic feature. Wide, slow, and richly productive. A highway of movement and a larder of food. The kind of river that draws human settlement to its banks the way a magnet draws iron filings. And it was not alone. Seismic surveys of the North Sea floor, conducted in the early 21st century, have revealed a landscape of extraordinary complexity beneath the sediment. Ancient river channels braiding across the plain. The ghost outlines of lakes and wetlands. Low ridges that were once wooded hills overlooking broad river valleys. The topography of a real, fully formed landscape, frozen in the mud 8,000 years after the water took it. The people who would inherit this transformed landscape were themselves transformed. The Paleolithic wanderers of the Ice Age tundra gave way, over many generations, to a different kind of human being. Not biologically different in any meaningful sense, but culturally, technologically, and spiritually adapted to a new world. These were the Mesolithic peoples of northwestern Europe, the hunter-gatherers of the post-glacial. And modern science has recently given us a remarkable portrait of who they were. Ancient DNA extracted from their bones, pulled from sites across Britain and Scandinavia, tells us they carried the genetic signature we call Western hunter-gatherers. They had, in a combination that seems startling to modern eyes, dark skin, dark hair, and pale blue eyes. They were on average tall and lean, physically capable in ways that their more sedentary descendants would struggle to match. They lived intimately with the land, as they had no choice but to do, reading it the way we might read a map or a clock. They knew which rivers ran salmon in which season. They knew where the red deer gathered to rut in autumn. They knew which plants were edible, which were medicinal, and which were deadly. This knowledge was not written down. It was held in the mind, passed from elder to child in the long evenings by the fire, accumulated over generations into a practical wisdom about the living world that we have largely lost and would struggle to replicate. They were not primitive. They were not simple. They were the product of at least 300,000 years of human cognitive and cultural evolution. They had language, certainly, social structures, spiritual beliefs, art. Some of their contemporaries, just slightly to the east, were already beginning the first experiments with agriculture. But the people of Doggerland, blessed with an environment so productive that farming would have seemed an unnecessary complication, were still living the old way. The older, wilder, richer way. They had no reason to change. And for thousands of years, they did not need to. This is where the story truly begins. Not on the ice, not in the tundra, but here, in the warming world, on the richest piece of real estate in prehistoric Europe. The warming continues. The ice retreats further north with every passing century. The forests thicken and spread. The rivers run full and clean. The land, for all its youth and wildness, is generous almost beyond measure to those who know how to read it. And they do. They know it intimately. They love it in the wordless, embodied way that people love a place they have lived in for generations. Every river bend is known. Every hilltop is named in whatever language they speak. Every seasonal path is worn into the earth by 10,000 feet over 100 years. This land is not a backdrop to their lives. It is their lives. It is the source of every meal, every tool, every story told around every fire. They do not know, because they cannot know, that the very warmth that has made their world so abundant is also the force that is measuring out its end. The ice continues to melt, far to the north, far to the west, in places these people will never go and cannot imagine. Enormous sheets of ancient ice are releasing their water into the ocean. Slowly, steadily, relentlessly, the sea is rising. Not fast enough to notice in a single lifetime. Not fast enough to inspire panic or prophecy. Just a little higher with each generation. A beach that was wide in a grandmother's memory, narrowing to nothing in a grandchild's. A marsh that was firm ground in childhood, becoming open water by middle age. Change is easy to absorb, easy to explain away, easy to accept as simply the nature of things. But the nature of things, in this case, is pointing in only one direction. The world is warming. The ice is melting. And out in the low, flat, magnificent heart of the connected continent, the clock that these people do not know is ticking, is counting down to something that will not survive. The eating is reaching its peak. And the sea that will consume, it is already on its way. There is a particular quality of light that comes off a river in the early morning. When a mist is still sitting low on the water, and the surface catches the first pale gold of the sun, and everything along the bank, the reeds, the alder trees, the half-submerged roots, is wet and shining and perfectly still. It is a light that feels ancient. And it is. That light has been falling on rivers in this part of the world for tens of thousands of years. 8,000 years ago, on a morning exactly like that one, a man or a woman might have stood on the bank of a wide, slow river in the heart of Doggerland and watched that light come up. They would have listened to the calls of waterbirds waking in the reed beds. They would have felt the cool air off the water on their face, carrying the smell of mud and fish and green growing things. They would have known, with the particular certainty of someone who has lived their whole life in one landscape, exactly what the day ahead of them would bring. That river is now the floor of the North Sea. That moment is gone so completely that no memory of it survives anywhere on Earth. And yet we know it happened, because the land that held it, the rivers, the reed beds, the wooded hills above the plain, is still down there. Still preserved in the sediment and peat and ancient soil of the seabed, waiting for us to read it. And what it tells us, when we learn to read it properly, is extraordinary. By 8,000 years ago, Doggerland had been warming and growing for nearly 7,000 years. The brutal tundra of the last glacial maximum was a distant memory, preserved only in the bones of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses turning slowly to stone in the permafrost. The landscape that had replaced, it was something else entirely. Something that, if you could see it today, you would recognize instantly as beautiful. The climate of Doggerland at its peak was close to, and in some seasons perhaps warmer than, the climate of modern-day southern England. Long, mild summers. Winters cold, but not severe. Rainfall distributed generously across the year. Not the punishing, marginal climate of the Ice Age world. A forgiving climate. A generous one. And the land responded to that generosity with an almost reckless abundance. Start with the trees. The great forests of the Atlantic period, as climatologists call this warm, wet phase of post-glacial Europe were not the managed, fragmented woodlands we are familiar with today. They were continuous, dense, and immensely old. Oak and hazel dominated on the better drained soils of the higher ground, forming a deep canopy that filtered the light into a permanent green dusk on the forest floor. Alder and willow and ash crowded the river margins. Lime trees, now rare in Britain but once extraordinarily common, grew in great stands on the warmer, south-facing slopes. These were not silent forests. They were loud with life. The drumming of woodpeckers, the territorial calls of tawny owls in the early dark, the crashing movement of large animals through the undergrowth. The forest of Doggerland was not a barrier to life. It was the architecture of life. Every tree a habitat, every hollow trunk a home, every fallen log a world of its own. But Doggerland was not only forest, and that is what made it so exceptional. The key to Doggerland's extraordinary ecological richness was water. Not the water that would eventually destroy it, but the water that in its peak years defined it. Because Doggerland was, at its heart, a wetland civilization. The rivers that crossed it were not modest streams. The Thames of 8,000 years ago was a considerably larger river than the one that flows through London today. It did not end at what is now the Thames estuary. It continued east and north across the Doggerland plain, gathering tributaries, widening and deepening as it went. The Rhine, one of the great rivers of Europe, did not stop at the Dutch coast. It too flowed on into Doggerland, joining the Thames and the Meuse and the Scheldt in a vast, complex river delta in the interior of the plain. This convergence of major European river systems created something that ecologists today would recognize as one of the most productive habitat types on Earth, a river delta wetland. The kind of landscape you find today in the Okavango Delta of Botswana or in the Mississippi Delta before modern agriculture transformed it. A shifting, braided, perpetually renewing world of channels and islands, of reed beds and open water and seasonal floodplains, of fish and waterfowl and mammal life in concentrations that beggar description. The fish alone would have been staggering. Atlantic salmon running up the rivers from the sea in their millions. Eels, almost impossibly numerous by modern standards, threading through every channel and backwater. Pike hunting in the shallower lakes. Perch and roach in the slower reaches. And in the coastal shallows, where the rivers met the sea, a whole additional universe of marine abundance. Sea bass, flatfish cod, herring, and shellfish in beds so thick they would have been visible from the bank. The birds would have been no less astonishing. Cranes nesting in the reed beds. White-tailed eagles patrolling the river margins. Great bustards on the open grasslands above the floodline. Ducks and geese and wading birds in numbers that we, living in a world where those populations have been reduced to a fraction of their former size, can barely conceive. The dawn chorus in Doggerland would have been, to modern ears, overwhelming. And on the land above the floodplains, in the forests and on the open grassland edges, the larger animals. Red deer in herds. Aurochs, the great wild cattle of prehistoric Europe, enormous animals standing nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, grazing in the clearings and along the river margins. Wild boar crashing through the undergrowth. Beavers engineering the wetlands with their dams, creating new ponds and marshes that in turn created new habitat for everything else. Wolves moving in packs through the forest. Brown bears, large and unhurried, following the salmon runs in the autumn. This was not a marginal landscape. It was not a difficult landscape. It was, by any measure we can apply, one of the most resource-rich environments in all of Mesolithic Europe, perhaps in all of the world, and the people who lived in it knew it. The Mesolithic inhabitants of Doggerland were not, to use the word that has so long and so unjustly been applied to their kind, primitive. Set that word aside. It has done more damage to our understanding of prehistoric humanity than almost any other single word in the English language. It conjures images of grunting, stooped figures with clubs, barely distinguishable from the animals they hunted. It is not just wrong. It is the opposite of right. The people of Doggerland were the inheritors of a cognitive and cultural tradition that stretched back in an unbroken line of innovation and adaptation for at least 300,000 years. Their brains were identical to yours. Their capacity for language, for abstraction, for emotion, for art, for spiritual reflection was exactly what yours is. They simply lived in a different world and had solved its problems in different ways. And they had solved them brilliantly. Take their technology. The Mesolithic toolkit, centered on what archaeologists call microliths, small, precisely knapped flint blades designed to be hafted into composite tools, was a sophisticated, modular, adaptable technology. A set of standardized components that could be assembled into a spear, an arrow, a knife, a scraper, or a saw depending on the need. Lightweight and portable because these were people who moved with the seasons. But also precise and effective, the product of skills passed down through generations of careful teaching and practice. The flintwork found in Mesolithic sites across Britain and Northern Europe is not rough or accidental. It is deliberate, expert. The napper who shaped a pressure-flaked microlith 8,000 years ago understood the grain and the fracture properties of flint as intimately as a modern machinist understands the tolerances of steel. It was a craft that took years to learn and a lifetime to master. And beyond the flintwork, there was wood, bone, antler, plant fiber, hide. The Mesolithic people used every material their environment provided, and they used it intelligently. Dugout canoes for the rivers, fish traps woven from hazel withies, bows of yew, carefully shaped to maximize their spring. Baskets and bags and containers of plant fiber so precisely woven that some, preserved in waterlogged sites, survive to this day. We know these things not because the people of Doggerland left us written records. They did not. We know them because the sea, in one of history's great ironies, has preserved their world better than the land ever could. The peat and waterlogged sediment of the North Sea floor is, in archaeological terms, a time capsule. The same anaerobic conditions that make the seabed a hostile environment for modern life are perfect for the preservation of organic material. Would have rotted to nothing within a generation if left in open air survives for thousands of years in the oxygen-deprived mud. Bone, antler, plant material, even pollen, the microscopic record of the vegetation that once grew on the surface survives in the sediment cores pulled from the seabed. And it is from the seabed that the artifacts of Doggerland have been coming, almost entirely by accident, for over a century. The trawlermen of the southern North Sea have always known that something was down there. For as long as there has been a commercial fishing fleet working the banks between England and the Netherlands, fishermen have been pulling strange objects up in their nets. Bones too large for any modern animal. Stones that bore the unmistakable marks of human shaping. Pieces of dark, waxy material that turned out, when analyzed, to be ancient peat, the compressed remains of terrestrial vegetation from a time when that part of the seabed was dry land and growing things. Most of these finds are thrown back, or kept as curiosities on a shelf above the kitchen table. Unremarked, unrecorded, gradually dispersed into the ordinary chaos of life. But not all of them. In 1931, the crew of a Dutch fishing trawler called the Kalinda were working the Leman and Our banks, a shallow area of the southern North Sea roughly 60 miles off the coast of Norfolk. Somewhere in the normal run of a fishing day, they hauled up a lump of peat from the seabed. The mate, a man paying more attention than most, noticed something embedded in it. He pried it out. It was a barb antler point, stained dark by centuries in the peat, roughly 9 inches long. Its barbs, the small backward-facing hooks designed to hold a harpoon in a wounded animal, were still sharp. A tool made by a human hand, found in a block of peat pulled from 100 feet of water, 25 miles from the nearest modern shore. The Kalinda harpoon, as it became known, was eventually dated to somewhere between 10,000 and 11,500 years ago. It was not made at the bottom of the sea. It was made on dry land, land that was now, and had been for thousands of years, submerged beneath the North Sea. It was, at the time, more a curiosity than a revelation. A single object proving what geologists had already theorized. But as the decades passed and more objects followed, the picture began to accumulate. Mammoth bones with cut marks, bear skulls, worked flints, deer antler tools, human bone fragments, occasionally, all from the seabed, all pointing to the same conclusion. There had been people out there, living their lives on land that was now deep underwater, and their world was not gone. It was simply submerged. To understand the lives of those people more fully, we turn not just to the objects pulled from the sea, but to the wider body of Mesolithic archaeology from Britain and Scandinavia, from the terrestrial sites that once shared a cultural world with Doggerland. One site, above all others, has shaped our understanding of Mesolithic life in this part of the world. It lies not under the North Sea, but on the eastern coast of Yorkshire, at a place called Starcar. Starcar was first excavated in the late 1940s by archaeologist Graham Clark, and has been reinvestigated many times since. What it revealed, and continues to reveal, is a window into Mesolithic life of astonishing clarity. The site was occupied, on and off, for somewhere between 300 and 500 years, beginning around 10,800 years ago. It sat beside a now-vanished lake, and the waterlogged conditions preserved organic material to a degree almost unmatched in British archaeology. Among the thousands of objects recovered from Starcar were the famous red deer skull headdresses. 21 of them. Deer skulls with their antlers still attached, carefully prepared and modified, their weight reduced by thinning, holes pierced through the skull plate. They are like nothing else from this period in Britain, and their most likely interpretation, the one that the evidence supports most convincingly, is that they were worn. Perhaps in ceremony, perhaps in hunting ritual, perhaps in the kind of shamanistic practice that we know from ethnographic parallels among modern hunter-gatherer cultures around the world. These were not objects made by people whose inner lives were limited to the practicalities of survival. These were objects made by people who had a relationship with the natural world that was not purely economic. A relationship that was symbolic, spiritual, charged with meaning that we can only partly recover. The people of Doggerland lived in the same cultural world as the people of Starcar. They were in all likelihood the same people, moving seasonally between the interior of the lost land and the higher coastal margins that would eventually become Britain, following the herds, following the rivers, following the seasons. It is worth pausing here because this is a point that tends to get lost in the archaeology. The people of Doggerland were not isolated. They were not a separate island civilization cut off from the wider world. They were the center of a cultural network that extended across the entirety of northwestern Europe. Before the flooding, before Britain became an island, the populations on either side of what is now the North Sea were a single, interconnected human community. The people who would eventually become the Mesolithic inhabitants of Britain and the people who would eventually become the inhabitants of Denmark and the Netherlands were, in this period, not two separate populations. They were one, moving freely across the land that connected them, trading, intermarrying, exchanging ideas, sharing stories, carrying with them the portable cultural currency of a society that had no fixed borders. Modern genetic studies have confirmed this with extraordinary precision. The ancient DNA of Mesolithic individuals from Britain shows close genetic affinity with contemporary individuals from Scandinavia. They were, in the most literal biological sense, related. Cousins, perhaps, or communities who had separated only a few generations before the samples were taken. The flooding of Doggerland did not just destroy a landscape. It severed a kinship network. It cut apart a human community that had been continuous for thousands of years. The people left on the British shore and the people left on the European shore were suddenly, for the first time, separated by water, by a barrier that their boats could cross, but that their herds and their deer and their forests could not. That separation had consequences that would echo across the entire subsequent history of these islands. Let us return for a moment to the landscape itself, because there is one feature of Doggerland that deserves particular attention, and that the modern seismic mapping of the North Sea floor has brought into extraordinary focus. In the heart of what was once Doggerland, sitting on what is now the Dogger Bank, there rose a region of slightly higher ground. Not mountains, not even dramatic hills, but a gentle, rolling upland, perhaps several hundred feet above the level of the surrounding plains, that would have offered long views across the interior of the lost land in every direction. Think about what that high ground represented in the life of a Mesolithic community. Elevation, visibility, a place from which you could watch the movement of deer across the plain below. A place from which you could see the weather coming, the squall line moving in from the west, the clear sky promising a good day's hunting. A place, perhaps, with spiritual significance. A place from which the world could be seen whole. The Dogger Hills, as some researchers have taken to calling this high ground, were probably among the last parts of Doggerland to be submerged. When everything around them was already salt water, these hills may have persisted as islands, low and shrinking, surrounded by the rising sea, but still for a time habitable. We will return to those islands, because their fate, when it finally came, was not gentle. In thinking about the daily life of Doggerland's people, we have one advantage that previous generations of archaeologists did not. We have the science of ethnoarchaeology, the study of living hunter-gatherer societies to illuminate the lives of their prehistoric counterparts. With all appropriate caution, because no modern society is a perfect window into an ancient one, the ethnographic record of hunter-gatherer communities around the world offers some illuminating patterns. Mesolithic communities in an environment as rich as Doggerland would likely have lived in relatively small, mobile groups for much of the year. Perhaps 15 to 50 individuals. Kin-based, moving along seasonal rounds that took them from one productive resource patch to another, following the rhythms of the landscape as reliably as the landscape itself followed the rhythms of the sun. Autumn would have brought the red deer rut, the great gathering of deer in open clearings and forest edges, the stags bellowing across the mist, the hunters moving carefully downwind. The kill, when it came, was not just protein. It was hide for clothing and shelter, bone and antler for tools, fat for waterproofing and fire lighting, sinew for binding and bowstrings. Almost nothing was wasted. A people who depended entirely on their environment for survival could not afford waste. Winter would have meant the caches, the food preserved through smoking and drying and storage, the long evenings close to the fire, the time for making and mending tools, the time for story. This is a point that gets underemphasized in discussions of prehistoric life. Hunter-gatherers in resource-rich environments do not spend every waking hour in the desperate pursuit of food. They have leisure time. They have social time. They have the cognitive surplus, if you want to use the modern term, for culture. And they used it. Spring was the salmon. The first runs of the season moving up the rivers from the sea, predictable almost to the day, arriving year after year at the same bends and the same rivers where the same fish traps had been set by this family's grandmother and her grandmother before her. The fish trap was not just technology. It was inheritance, a claim on a river, a statement about belonging. Summer was the longest days and the widest ranging, moving out across the open landscape, gathering plant foods in addition to the animal protein that dominated the winter diet. Hazelnuts in particular, which ripened in enormous quantities in the Doggerland forest and could be stored almost indefinitely, were a critical resource. Sites across Mesolithic Britain have yielded thousands of roasted hazelnut shells, the carbonized remnants of autumn processing camps where families gathered to harvest and prepare the nuts for the lean months ahead. This was not a life of desperation. In a landscape as generous as Doggerland, it was by any reasonable measure a good life. A hard life, certainly. A life without the insulations from physical reality that we take entirely for granted. A life in which a bad winter, an injury, a difficult childbirth, could be lethal in ways that modern medicine has largely made unimaginable. But it was a life lived in extraordinary intimacy with a world of great beauty and abundance. And the people who lived it were not waiting for civilization to arrive and rescue them from their backwardness. They were civilization, a different kind, older, wilder, and in some ways more deeply intelligent about the living world than anything that came after them. How many people lived in Doggerland? It is a question that archaeology cannot answer with confidence. The evidence from the seabed is fragmentary. The sites on the surrounding land that might once have been the margins of Doggerland's population have been eroded, built over, or simply not yet found. Honest archaeologists will tell you that any population estimate for Doggerland is precisely that, an estimate, an educated inference from incomplete data. But estimates have been made, and they are not trivial. Based on comparisons with other Mesolithic environments of similar ecological richness, and on the carrying capacity of the landscape as reconstructed from the seabed data, some researchers have proposed that Doggerland at its peak may have supported a population in the range of 10,000 to 20,000 people. Others suggest lower numbers. A few suggest the higher end might even be conservative. Whatever the precise figure, the demographic implication is significant. Doggerland was not a lightly traveled corridor. It was a populated homeland. And the people who lived in it were not a small, isolated group, but part of the broader human community of northwestern European prehistory. They would have known one another, at least in the way that small-scale societies know the people within a day or two's travel of their own territory. They would have met at seasonal aggregation sites, those gatherings that ethnographic evidence tells us are universal in hunter-gatherer societies, where people come together not just to trade and exchange, but to find partners, resolve disputes, share knowledge, and renew the social bonds that hold a dispersed community together. Perhaps those gatherings happened on the Dogger Hills, on the highest ground in the interior, where the view stretched to every horizon, where the landmarks were known and the fires could be seen from far away, where the living and the dead were connected in whatever ceremonies these people used to mark the passage of time and the turning of the world. We do not know for certain, but the feeling that something important happened on that high ground, at the heart of a civilization that no longer exists, is difficult to shake. Let us speak for a moment about the dead, because a civilization is not just its living members. It is also its relationship with those who have gone before. And the Mesolithic peoples of northwestern Europe had a relationship with their dead that was not casual or indifferent. Burial sites from this period, found across Britain and Scandinavia, tell a story of careful, deliberate, emotionally invested treatment of human remains. Bodies placed in specific positions. Grave goods, tools, animal teeth, red ochre pigment, included with the dead. Evidence, in some cases, of structures built over or around burial sites. The deliberate marking of a place as sacred by the investment of labor and intention. The red ochre is particularly striking. This vivid red mineral pigment appears in Mesolithic burials across an enormous geographic range, from the Atlantic coast to the Russian plains. It was clearly not just decoration. It carried meaning. Perhaps it represented blood. Perhaps life itself. Perhaps the connection between the living and the world they came from and would return to. We cannot know, with certainty, what it meant to the people who used it. But we know it meant something. And that is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything that matters. Because it tells us that these were people who looked at death and felt the need to respond to it with ceremony, with intention, with a marking of something irreplaceable lost. The people of Doggerland did the same. Some of them, at least, are still down there, buried on dry land 8,000 years ago, now resting under 100 feet of cold water. Occasionally, impossibly, turning up in the nets of a fishing trawler, a skull fragment or a femur, dark and dense with age, brought back to the light for the first time in millennia. Each time that happens, it is not just an archaeological event. It is a reunion of a kind. A moment in which the modern world reaches back across 8,000 years and touches the hand of someone who stood on ground that no longer exists, under a sky that still does. There is one more dimension of Mesolithic Doggerland that deserves acknowledgement, because without it, the picture is incomplete. The sea. We have spoken of Doggerland largely as a terrestrial landscape, a place of forests and rivers and wetlands. And it was all of those things. But it also had a coastline. A long, complex, ecologically rich coastline. And the people of Doggerland were not landlocked. They were coastal people too. The shell middens, those enormous refuse heaps of shellfish remains that are among the most characteristic signatures of Mesolithic coastal life, found along the margins of what was then the Doggerland shore, speak to an intimate relationship with the intertidal zone. Oysters, cockles, mussels, limpets, collected in enormous quantities at low tide, eaten fresh or smoked for storage. But beyond the shellfish, there was deeper water. Seals hauling out on the sandbanks. Porpoise visible from the shore. Perhaps even, on exceptional days, the breath of a whale spouting on the horizon. We have evidence from sites across Mesolithic northern Europe that these people were not just coastal foragers. They were seafarers. Dugout canoes capable of open water crossings have been found in Mesolithic contexts. Fishhooks and gorges of bone and antlers suggest active fishing beyond the intertidal. The colonization of offshore islands in this period required watercraft of some capability and some courage. The people of Doggerland looked at the sea and saw not a boundary, but a resource. Not an ending, but a continuation of the same generous world that surrounded them on every side. They had no way of knowing that the sea they fished and paddled and watched from the shore was the same force that was, at that very moment, measuring out the dimensions of their destruction. This is Doggerland at its zenith. Vast, teeming, rich beyond measure. A landscape that has no modern equivalent, because the combination of temperate climate, enormous wetland systems, unlogged ancient forest, and fully intact megafauna that once characterized it exists nowhere on Earth today. The closest analogy might be the great river deltas of sub-Saharan Africa, but with a colder sky and a people who have been learning this particular landscape for 10,000 years. Its people are not footnotes to history. They are history. They are us, in the most direct possible sense. Their genetic descendants are reading these words right now, on every continent on Earth, carrying in their bodies the biological inheritance of people who once stood on ground that is now the floor of the North Sea. Their world is gone, but it was real as the city you live in, as real as the street outside your window, as real as anything you have ever known or loved. And it was ending, not with a crash or a cry, not in fire or in battle, but in the slow, irresistible grammar of a changing climate. With every generation, just a little more water. Every decade, just a little higher. Every century, a little more land taken by the sea and not returned. The people adapted. They were extraordinarily good at adapting. For thousands of years, they absorbed the losses and rebuilt their lives on the higher ground. They were resilient in ways that humankind, in its comfortable modern forms, has largely forgotten how to be. But there is a limit to resilience. There is always a limit. And something was coming that no amount of resilience, no accumulated wisdom, no depth of knowledge about the living world could prepare them for. The ice was melting. The seas were rising. And somewhere far to the north, in the deep cold water off the Norwegian coast, an event was building in the dark that would end their world not slowly, but all at once. The Eden was at its peak. The fall was coming. There's a particular cruelty in the way the world ends slowly. Not the cruelty of malice. There is no malice in geology. No intention in the movement of ocean water or the calving of an ice sheet. The cruelty is quieter than that. It is the cruelty of indifference, of a process so vast and so unhurried that no single human life is long enough to see its full shape. A process that asks nothing of you and takes everything from you, one generation at a time, with the patience of something that measures its own progress not in years or decades, but in centuries. This is the story of what happened to Doggerland after its golden age. And it begins not with a wave or a flood or a dramatic rupture in the earth. It begins with something so ordinary, so unremarkable in the daily life of a Mesolithic family on the banks of a Doggerland river, that they would not have had a word for it. It begins with warmth. To understand what happened to Doggerland, you first have to understand what was happening to the planet. The Ice Age did not end on a single day. It did not announce itself. It did not send a messenger ahead. It simply, over thousands of years, and with many false starts and reversals, exhaled. The vast engine of cold that had dominated the northern hemisphere for nearly 100,000 years slowly, in geological terms almost instantaneously, ran out of the conditions it needed to sustain itself. The mechanism was orbital. Over tens of thousands of years, small, predictable variations in the Earth's path around the Sun, its tilt, its wobble, the shape of its orbit, had been slowly shifting the distribution of solar energy across the planet's surface. These cycles, named Milankovitch cycles after the Serbian mathematician who first calculated them in the early 20th century, are not dramatic. They are subtle, but they are cumulative. And by around 15,000 years ago, they had tilted the balance of the planet's energy budget just far enough toward warmth that the great ice sheets began to lose more mass each summer than they could replace each winter. And once that process began, it developed a momentum of its own. Ice reflects sunlight. It is one of the most reflective surfaces on Earth. A planet covered in ice reflects an enormous proportion of the solar energy that strikes it straight back into space, keeping itself cold by its own whiteness. But as the ice retreats, the darker surfaces beneath, the rock, the soil, the ocean, are exposed. These darker surfaces absorb solar energy instead of reflecting it. They warm. And as they warm, they melt more ice, which exposes more dark surface, which absorbs more energy, which melts more ice. Climatologists call this ice albedo feedback. It is a self-reinforcing loop. And once it gets going at sufficient scale, it runs. Not forever, not without limit, but for a very long time, and with consequences that cascade through the entire Earth system in ways that continue long after the initial trigger has faded. This is what was running in the background of every single day of Mesolithic life in Doggerland. A planetary feedback loop, grinding forward with geological determination, raising temperatures, melting ice, and pouring the resulting water into the world's oceans with a consistency that nothing in human experience or human capability could interrupt. The first great pulse of warming came around 14,700 years ago, in the period climatologists call the Balling-Alarod interstadial. We mentioned this in the opening of our story. But now, standing at the edge of Doggerland's destruction, it is worth understanding its full significance. The Balling-Alarod warming was not gentle. In the space of perhaps 50 years, possibly fewer, average temperatures across the North Atlantic region rose by somewhere between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius. In human terms, 50 years is 2 generations. In climate terms, it is the blink of an eye. The warming was so rapid that even the most sophisticated modern climate models struggle to fully account for it. What triggered it, ultimately, was a change in the circulation of the Atlantic Ocean. The vast conveyor belt of ocean current that moves warm tropical water northward and cold deep water southward. The system we call the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, shifted into a configuration that pumped more heat into the North Atlantic. Temperatures soared, ice retreated, and the meltwater began. But the planet was not yet done with cold. Around 12,900 years ago, something happened that interrupted the warming with sudden and dramatic force. The Younger Dryas, named for a cold-tolerant Arctic flower that reappeared across northern Europe during this period, brought temperatures crashing back down. In some parts of the North Atlantic region, temperatures fell by as much as 15 degrees Celsius within decades. The glaciers advanced again. The tundra returned. The warming forests retreated southward. The cause of the Younger Dryas is still debated among climate scientists. The most widely accepted explanation involves a catastrophic release of cold, fresh water from the massive glacial lakes of North America, particularly the enormous Lake Agassiz, into the North Atlantic. This flood of cold, fresh water disrupted the ocean circulation system, shutting down the heat pump that had been warming the region and plunging it back in a near-glacial cold. For the people living through it, the Younger Dryas was a climate reversal of profound difficulty. The forests that had been advancing northward retreated. The animals changed again. Life on the exposed plains of what would become Doggerland became harder. But the cold did not last. It could not last because the underlying orbital forcing was still moving in the direction of warmth. Around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended. And this time, the ending was even more abrupt than the beginning. Ice core records from Greenland show a warming of around 10 degrees Celsius occurring in as little as 3 years. 3 years. A child born into a cold, semi-glacial world might have seen it transform, within their own early memory, into something approaching the temperate landscape we recognize today. The great ice sheets of the northern hemisphere began their final, irreversible retreat, and the water locked in them, accumulated over 100,000 years of cold, began its long journey back to the sea. Here is the number that haunts this story. At the last glacial maximum, roughly 22,000 years ago, so much of the planet's water was locked in ice that global sea levels sat approximately 360 feet below where they are today. 360 feet. Over the subsequent 15,000 years, as the ice melted, all of that water returned to the ocean. All it had to go somewhere. The rise was not uniform. It was not a smooth, gradual, metronomic lift. It was episodic, lurching, punctuated by periods of relative stability and then sudden, dramatic jumps driven by catastrophic releases of meltwater from collapsing ice dams or disintegrating ice sheets. The most dramatic of these events are called meltwater pulses, and the largest of them, Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurring around 14,600 years ago, may be the most significant single sea level event in the history of human civilization. The estimates vary, but the best current science suggests that Meltwater Pulse 1A raised global sea levels by somewhere between 40 and 60 feet in as little as 300 to 500 years. Some models suggest even faster, perhaps as little as a century. 40 to 60 feet of sea level rise in a century. To put that in modern terms, the sea level rise projected by the most pessimistic mainstream climate models for the next 100 years is measured in feet, not tens of feet. The exact source of all that meltwater is still a subject of scientific debate. Large contributions from the Laurentide ice sheet over North America and from Antarctic ice are both implicated. What is not debated is the result. A staggering volume of water poured into the world's oceans in a geological instant. And everywhere those oceans had shallow coastal margins, the land disappeared beneath the waves at a rate that may, in some locations, have been detectable within a single human lifetime. This was not happening yet to the heart of Doggerland. The Central Plain was still too elevated, too far from the encroaching shorelines, to feel the full force of these early pulses. But the edges of the world were already drowning, and the memory of that early drowning may have been carried forward in the stories and the deep cultural knowledge of the people who survived it. By 10,000 years ago, the worst of the meltwater pulses had passed. The great ice sheets of the northern hemisphere had shed the majority of their mass. Sea levels had risen by more than 250 feet from their glacial low point. The pace of rise had slowed from the terrifying rates of the early post-glacial, but had not stopped. And for the people of Doggerland, the slowing of the pace was not reassurance. It was simply the adjustment of the timeline. The destination remained the same. The sea was still rising. It was rising at perhaps 1 to 3 feet per century. Fast enough, over a human lifetime of perhaps 35 to 40 years, to produce a noticeable change in the landscape you had grown up in. Slow enough, within that same lifetime, to be explained away, rationalized, absorbed into the background of normal experience. The coastlines retreating, the marshes at the river mouths going brackish, then saline. The freshwater reed beds dying back as salt penetrated the soil. These were changes that a grandmother might point out to a grandchild. See that line of dead trees? When I was your age, that was a forest with good firm ground beneath it. The water was not there. These things happen. The world changes. We move inland. We move inland. That sentence, in 3 words, contains the entire human response to Doggerland's slow drowning for thousands of years. Not panic, not catastrophe, adaptation. The extraordinarily flexible, deeply practical, enormously intelligent response of a people who had been reading and responding to environmental change for the entire span of their existence as a species. And for a long time it worked. The archaeology of the British Isles and the surrounding European coast during this period shows something consistent and telling. As the Mesolithic progresses, as the sea levels continue their patient rise, the population density of inland sites, and particularly of upland and coastal sites on the margins of the drowning plain, appears to increase. This is not coincidence. It is the archaeological signature of a migration. Not a panic flight, not a sudden displacement, but a gradual, multi-generational movement of people from the low-lying interior of Doggerland toward the higher ground on the margins. They came to the shores of what would become Britain, to the river valleys of what would become East Anglia and Yorkshire and the Scottish coast. They brought their culture with them, their technology, their knowledge of the landscape, their relationships with one another. They moved inland as their world moved underwater, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that was being compressed, reduced, squeezed upward by the rising water. And as they arrived on the higher ground, they encountered or reconnected with communities already living there. The populations of the British Peninsula, already established on the hills and river valleys of what would become England, Scotland, and Wales, absorbed the refugees from the drowning plain. The genetics blended. The cultures merged. The knowledge of the lost land was absorbed into the new communities growing on the dry ground above the flood. But what was being lost in that process was not just land. It was memory. With each generation that grew up further from the flooding margins, the specific, intimate knowledge of the drowned landscape faded. The paths through the forest that no longer existed. The fishing spots on the rivers that were now the floor of a bay. The hills where the deer gathered that were now, on a clear day, just barely visible above the surface as a low ridge of exposed sand at low tide. Slowly, the map of the known world shrank, and the world below the water became, for the people living above it, a place of story rather than of experience. Let's be specific about what the flooding looked like. Not in the abstract, not in terms of global averages and climate model outputs, but on the ground, in the lived experience of people standing at the edge of the water. In the south of Doggerland, where the shallow basin of what would become the English Channel was filling from both ends, the flooding was perhaps the most dramatically visible. The land bridge between what is now southeastern England and what is now northern France, the Great Chalk Ridge connecting Dover to Calais, had been eroding for thousands of years. At some point, the evidence suggests probably somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 years ago, the sea finally cut through that ridge, and the English Channel achieved something like its modern form. This was not necessarily a single dramatic event. The chalk geology of that region erodes in steps, through the progressive failure of cliff faces and the wearing away of natural dams. But there may have been episodes that were dramatic by human standards. A roaring of water through a new gap. A flood of seawater racing across the low ground on either side of the breach. A shoreline that moved in a single day further than it had moved in the previous decade. People would have seen this. They would have remembered it. They would have told the story. In the north of Doggerland, the process was different. The North Sea was filling from the north and from the south simultaneously, like a bathtub being filled from both ends. The Shetland Islands and the Orkney Islands were losing land. The coast of what is now northeastern Scotland was retreating. The shallow banks in the interior of the North Sea, the places that would cling longest to their above-water status, were being surrounded on all sides. The Dogger Hills, that slightly elevated interior of the lost land, held on, still connected to the surrounding plain through a network of tidal channels and exposed ridges, still offering higher ground for the communities retreating from the lower margins. Still, perhaps, a place of gathering, a place of memory, a place that older people pointed to from the coast and told the children about, when they were children themselves, when you could walk there, when the ground was firm and the deer ran through the forest and the river was wide and full. By around 8,000 years ago, the landscape that had once stretched unbroken from England to Denmark had been reduced to something far more fragmentary. The great interior of Doggerland was largely submerged. What remained above the waterline was a diminishing archipelago of low islands and exposed sandbanks, surrounded by the shallow, turbid waters of what was becoming the North Sea. The heart of the world was becoming a sea. and the people who had once walked across it could now only cross it in boats. It is worth pausing here to consider the emotional weight of what was happening. Not the geology of it, not the archaeology, but the human experience. We have, in the modern world, some reference points for this. Some windows into what it feels like to watch a homeland disappear beneath the water. The people of Kiribati, the low-lying Pacific island nation, are losing their land to sea level rise right now. Their islands are flooding, their freshwater lenses contaminated by saltwater intrusion, their coastal villages increasingly vulnerable to storm surge. When researchers and journalists have spoken to the people of Kiribati about what this means to them, the answers reveal something deeper than practical inconvenience. They speak of identity, of ancestry, of the graves of their grandparents being swallowed by the sea, of a place that exists in memory and story and song, and the terror that those stories may one day be all that remains. The Alaska Native community of Nutok in western Alaska has been engaged in a decades-long process of relocating their entire village as the permafrost beneath them thaws and the riverbanks erode. They have been fighting against enormous bureaucratic and financial obstacles. To move before the water takes everything. The elders speak of the landscape around them as a living presence, a relationship that cannot be fully transplanted, only mourned. The communities of coastal Bangladesh, watching the delta of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra slowly submerge beneath rising floodwaters, describe a grief that has no clean name in English. A grief for a place. A grief for the familiar. A grief not just for what is lost, but for the future that has been taken away before it could be lived. These are modern experiences, but the psychological architecture of grief is ancient. The people of Doggerland felt it. We cannot hear their words because they did not write words. We cannot see their faces. But in the depth of what was being taken from them, in the intimacy of their relationship with the landscape they were losing, the grief would have been the same. Perhaps that is the most important thing to understand about Doggerland. It was not just a land. It was a relationship. Thousands of years of accumulated knowing. A map held not on paper, but in the body. In the feet that knew where the ground went soft and where it was firm. In the hands that knew which stones made the best tools and where to find them. In the nose that could smell the rain coming from the west or the deer on the next hill. All of that knowledge was drowning. Slowly, inexorably, 1 foot of water at a time. The changing ecology of Doggerland's final centuries deserves its own close attention. Because the sea does not simply replace land when it rises. It transforms the landscape through which it moves in ways that cascade through every living system dependent on that landscape. As saltwater infiltrates the margins of a coastal plain, the first things to die are the freshwater plants. The reed beds that have lined the river mouths and provided nesting habitat for thousands of birds, cover for fish, and harvesting material for human communities, turned brown and collapsed as the salt concentration in the soil rose beyond the threshold they could tolerate. In their place came the salt marsh plants, tough, low-growing species adapted to the intertidal zone, productive in their own way, but not the same. Not what the people knew, not what they had built their lives around. The rivers themselves changed. As the sea rose, the gradient between the river source and the sea mouth decreased. Rivers that had once run swift and clean over gravel beds slowed and silted up. Estuaries widened. The salmon, which spawn in the clean gravel of fast-running upland streams, would have retreated progressively further inland as their habitat was compromised by the rising water. The great fish runs that had fed human communities for thousands of years were not lost overnight, but they were diminished, changed, less reliable. The forests at the coast were the most visually dramatic casualty. As the water table rose, as salt penetrated the groundwater, trees died. The great oaks and hazels and limes that had formed the coastal woodland of Doggerland were not adapted to flooding. They drown in place. And when a tree dies standing in a landscape that is becoming a tidal flat, it does not fall and decay quickly. It petrifies slowly, preserved by the waterlogged anaerobic conditions of the mud around its roots. It stands for centuries as a ghost forest, gray and skeletal, a memory of what the landscape had once been, written in dead wood above the waterline. We know these ghost forests existed in Doggerland because we can still find them. Across the coasts of eastern England and the southern North Sea, in places where the sea has not yet buried them entirely under sediment. The stumps of Mesolithic and Neolithic trees are visible at low tide. The Seahenge site in Norfolk, discovered in 1998, preserved a ring of ancient timber posts surrounding an upturned tree root, dating to around 4,000 years ago. But older still, on beaches across Norfolk and Suffolk, are the exposed stumps of forests that were drowned not 4,000 but 8,000 years ago. Submerged Doggerland trees, briefly reappearing at the lowest tides, confirming in the most visceral way possible that the land beneath our feet has a history far deeper than we can easily imagine. By around 8,200 years ago, a brief but significant cooling event, known in the climate literature as the 8.2 kilo-year event, temporarily slowed the rate of sea level rise. Another massive release of meltwater from the North American ice sheet into the Atlantic disrupted ocean circulation, dropping temperatures across the North Atlantic region by 1 to 3 degrees Celsius for a period of perhaps 150 years. This was not enough to reverse the flooding. The sea level did not drop. The inundation of Doggerland did not reverse. But it may have provided a temporary respite, a period in which the communities on the shrinking remnant islands and the adjacent coastal margins of Britain and Scandinavia experienced a brief slowing of the relentless pressure they had been living under. What they made of that respite, we cannot say. Perhaps the brief cooling, the slight contraction of the sea, gave momentary hope that the world was stabilizing, that the losses could be absorbed, that the higher ground they now occupied would be sufficient. If so, that hope was misplaced, because approximately 50 years after the 8.2 kilo-year event had run its course, and the warming had resumed, something was building in the dark water far to the north of Doggerland that would end any hope of gradual adaptation. Something that would compress the slow grief of centuries into a single, obliterating morning. The Norwegian coast, 8,150 years ago. The continental shelf west of Norway drops away steeply into the deep Atlantic. Along the upper edge of that shelf, in the cold, dark water above the drop-off, the sediment had been accumulating for thousands of years. Sands and silts delivered by rivers and glaciers, building up in layers on the relatively shallow shelf, resting at angles that were, under normal circumstances, stable enough. But the circumstances were not entirely normal. The warming of the deep ocean water, proceeding slowly and silently at depths that no human being would ever reach, was affecting the chemistry of the seafloor sediment. Methane hydrates, those strange ice-like compounds in which water molecules form cages around methane gas under the intense pressure and cold of the deep sea, were beginning to destabilize. As the water above them warmed, even slightly, the pressure and temperature conditions that held those hydrates together were shifting. The methane inside them was becoming restless. At the same time, or perhaps as a related consequence, or perhaps triggered by a seismic event that remains impossible to date precisely, the great mass of sediment on the Norwegian continental shelf was losing its grip. Slowly at first, then not slowly at all. What happened next was one of the largest underwater landslides in the documented geological history of this planet. The Storegga slide. We will tell its full story in the next act, as it deserves. But here, in the context of Doggerland's long decline, it is important to understand what it represents in the larger arc of this story. The slow drowning of Doggerland was the work of centuries, of thousands of years of patient, indifferent climate change, grinding away at the margins of a world. The people who lived through it adapted, migrated, grieved, and endured. They were extraordinarily resilient in the face of a loss that would have broken lesser cultures. But resilience has a limit, and a civilization built on the accommodation of slow change is not prepared for the sudden kind. The Storegga slide was not slow change. It was change at a velocity that no living thing in the path of it had any framework to understand. It was the planet speaking in a voice so loud and so final that it could not be adapted to, could not be accommodated, could not be survived. It was the end. And by the time it struck, Doggerland had already been dying for 4,000 years. The people on the remnant islands and the low coastal margins had spent their lives, and their parents' lives and their grandparents' lives, retreating from the water. They were, in the most profound sense, a people already acquainted with loss. Nothing had prepared them for the scale of what was coming. The sea had been patient with them for a very long time. It was about to stop being patient. Stand on the eastern coast of Britain today. At the beach in Norfolk, perhaps, or along the flat, windswept shore of Lincolnshire. Look out across the gray water of the North Sea toward the horizon. The sea is calm, most days. Heavy and cold and indifferent, but calm. Somewhere out there, under between 100 and 150 feet of water, is the ground that people walked on 8,000 years ago. The rivers they fished are down there. The forests they hunted through are down there. The campsites and the fire circles and the fish traps and the graves are down there. The world they built over 10,000 years is down there. And down there, too, is the full weight of what we are only now beginning to understand. That the story of Doggerland is not an ancient story in any sense that should comfort us. It is a story about what happens when a climate shifts, about what the world does to the people who are standing in the wrong place when the balance tips, about the breathtaking indifference of physical processes to human life and human meaning and human attachment to the ground beneath their feet. The people of Doggerland did nothing to cause their world to drown. The forces that took their land from them were planetary in scale, geological in patience, and utterly beyond any human agency to resist or reverse. They were innocent bystanders in a transformation that had been set in motion long before any of them were born. That innocence did not save them. The great thaw continued. The seas continued to rise. And far to the north, in the cold dark water above the Norwegian shelf, the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated sediment was reaching the limit of what the seafloor could hold. Something was about to give, and when it did, it would not give slowly. There are mornings that look exactly like the one before them. The same gray light coming up over the water. The same cold air off the sea. The same birds lifting from the reed beds at first light. The same sounds carrying across the tidal flats. The same smell of mud and salt, and the particular damp greenness of a northern coast in late summer. A morning that, to anyone standing on the shore of what remained of Doggerland 8,150 years ago, would have felt entirely ordinary. And then the sea did something it had never done before. Not in any living memory. Not in the stories of grandparents or great-grandparents. Not in any oral tradition reaching back to the earliest telling of the world. The sea, which had been rising for as long as anyone could remember, which had been advancing on the land with the patience of something that had all the time in the world, suddenly, without warning, without precedent, without a single sign that anyone on shore could have read, pulled back. The water retreated from the beach, further than any tide had ever taken it. The tidal flats exposed, wide and glistening, further than a person could run. The shallow channels draining. The exposed seafloor steaming faintly in the morning air. Fish stranded and gasping in the sudden absence of the water that had held them. Some people, perhaps, walked out onto that exposed ground. Curious, confused, reaching for the fish. They had perhaps 2 minutes. To understand the Storega slide, you have to understand the geography of the Norwegian continental shelf. Off the western coast of Norway, the seabed does something dramatic. For a distance out from shore, it is relatively shallow, a broad continental shelf sitting at manageable depths. Then at the shelf edge, it drops. Steeply, precipitously, down into the deep Atlantic basin. The slope at the shelf edge, the continental slope, is not a gentle incline. It is a genuine geological cliff, dropping thousands of feet into the abyss over a horizontal distance that, in geological terms, is very short. Along the upper edge of that slope, over thousands and thousands of years, sediment had accumulated. Delivered by glaciers during the Ice Age, by rivers afterward, by the slow rain of marine particles from the water above. Layer after layer, building up, compacting under its own weight, resting on the steep angle of the slope in a state of what geologists call metastable equilibrium. Stable, in other words, for now. Stable enough for the time being, but carrying within its own structure the potential for catastrophic failure. That potential had been building for a very long time. The precise trigger of the Storegga slide is still debated among geologists and oceanographers. The leading candidates are not mutually exclusive. They may all have contributed, in combination, to the final failure. The first is seismic activity. The crust of Norway and the surrounding region was, in this period, under considerable stress. The removal of the immense weight of the Scandinavian ice sheet, which had compressed the crust for tens of thousands of years, had set in motion a process of isostatic rebound, the slow rising of the crust as the weight of ice was removed. This rebounding crust is not uniform or smooth in its movement. It generates earthquakes, not always large ones. But the sediment on the Norwegian slope was not in a state that required a large earthquake to disturb it. It required only a nudge. The second trigger, and the one that connects most directly to the larger climate story, involves methane hydrates. These extraordinary compounds, sometimes called fire ice because they burn despite being frozen, form in the cold, high-pressure environment of the deep seafloor when methane gas, produced by the breakdown of organic matter in the sediment, becomes trapped within a lattice of water molecules. They are stable only within a specific range of temperature and pressure. Change those conditions and they decompose rapidly, releasing the gas they contain and, in doing so, dramatically reducing the structural integrity of the sediment around them. The warming of the deep North Atlantic during the post-glacial period was doing exactly that, slowly raising the temperature of the water above the Norwegian slope, slowly pushing the methane hydrates in the sediment toward the edge of their stability field, slowly loading the geological gun. We do not know which trigger pulled it. We know only, with the precision that geology allows, that approximately 8,150 years ago, the sediment on the Norwegian continental slope began to move. The scale of what happened next is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. An estimated 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment detached from the Norwegian shelf and slid into the deep Atlantic. 3,000 cubic kilometers. To give that number some purchase on the imagination, consider that the volume of Iceland, the entire island, is approximately 130 cubic kilometers. The Storegga slide moved the equivalent of more than 20 Iceland's worth of material in what, by geological standards, was essentially an instantaneous event. It was one of the 3 largest submarine landslides identified anywhere on Earth in the past 100,000 years. The scar it left on the Norwegian seafloor is visible in modern bathymetric surveys as a vast, semicircular indentation roughly 800 kilometers long and nearly 500 kilometers wide. A wound in the ocean floor so large that it can be seen from space in the right conditions of water clarity. When that volume of material moves, it does not simply slide silently into the deep. It displaces the water above it. Violently. Instantaneously. The ocean above the sliding sediment, millions upon millions of tons of seawater, is pushed upward and outward by the movement below. It has nowhere to go but up and away. And as it goes, it forms a wave. Not a wave in the sense that we ordinarily mean when we use that word. Not the rolling swells of a North Atlantic storm or the breaking surf of a sandy beach. This was a different kind of wave entirely. A tsunami. From the Japanese, meaning harbor wave. A displacement wave, driven not by wind, but by the sudden movement of the seafloor itself, carrying an energy that bears no relation to the height of its open ocean surface. In deep water, a tsunami is nearly invisible. A slight, long-period rise and fall of the sea surface, perhaps only a foot or 2 in height, spread across a wavelength of hundreds of miles. A ship caught above the Storegga slide, as it happened, might have felt only a barely perceptible lifting and settling of the hull. The energy was there. It was moving at the speed of a commercial jetliner, somewhere between 400 and 500 miles per hour in all directions from the source. But it was spread across such an enormous volume of water that its surface expression in the open ocean was almost nothing. Almost. The Norwegian coast fell at first. The wave struck the western coast of Norway within minutes of the slide. Here, in the shallowing water of the continental shelf and the fjords, the energy that had been spread thin across the open ocean compressed. The wavelength shortened. The height increased. Dramatically. The best estimates from the geological evidence suggest that wave struck parts of the Norwegian coast at heights of between 65 and 80 feet above normal sea level. In some fjords, where the geometry of the coastline focused the wave's energy into a narrowing channel, run-up heights may have been even greater. The evidence is written in the sediment, a distinct layer of marine sand and shell material deposited inland of the normal tidal reach, found in coastal bogs and lake sediments across western Norway. Geologists call it the Storegga tsunami deposit. It is one of the most precisely dated and most extensively studied tsunami deposits anywhere in the world. The Shetland Islands, sitting directly in the path of the wave as it traveled southwest from the source, were struck by water that may have reached 65 feet above sea level. The Faroe Islands, further out into the Atlantic, received the wave at somewhat reduced but still catastrophic heights. These are not theoretical calculations. They are based on the actual physical evidence in the ground. The layer of tsunami sediment is there. It has been found, described, analyzed, and dated by independent research teams across decades of study. It is real. It happened. It is not myth or speculation. It is geology. The wave traveled southwest toward the British Isles. As it crossed the northern North Sea, it encountered a body of water that was, in this period, relatively shallow. The North Sea is not the deep Atlantic. At its deepest, the northern North Sea sits at around 300 feet. Over much of its extent, it is considerably shallower. Shallow water does not reduce a tsunami's energy. It transforms it. As the wave slows in the shallowing water, its energy is compressed upward. The wave grows. The northeastern coast of what is now Scotland was struck by a wall of water estimated by the most careful geological reconstructions at between 20 and 65 feet in height. The exact figure varies with location. Headlands and bays focus wave energy differently. River mouths channeled the water inland. The flat, low-lying coastal plains of eastern Scotland, some of them only feet above sea level, offered no resistance. The Storegga tsunami deposit has been found in coastal sites across northeastern Scotland, at Montrose Basin, at Meriton, at a site called Inverness, at locations along the coast of Fife and Lothian, at Sullom Voe in Shetland, all carrying the same unmistakable signature. A layer of marine sediment, sharply defined above and below, deposited in a single event, dated to approximately 8,150 years ago. Carbon-14 dating, pollen analysis, microfossil identification, multiple independent lines of evidence, all pointing to the same event, the same moment, the same wave. The evidence is so extensive and so consistent that when researchers from the University of Dundee and associated institutions mapped the distribution of tsunami deposits around the North Sea in the early 2000s, they were able to reconstruct with some confidence the height and reach of the wave at multiple points along the affected coastline. It is a map of a catastrophe. Now consider what the wave meant for the remnant of Doggerland. By 8,150 years ago, the original vast interior of a lost land was already largely underwater. What remained above the surface was a diminishing archipelago of low islands and exposed banks, centered on the slightly higher ground of what is now the Dogger Bank, surrounded by the shallow, turbid waters of the Proto-North Sea. These are not high islands. They were not cliffs or headlands or elevated ground with any meaningful refuge above the incoming water. They were low, flat, and largely at or near sea level. The highest points of the Dogger Bank rise to perhaps 80 to 90 feet above the modern seafloor, which in this period may have translated to perhaps 30 to 60 feet above the water surface that surrounded them, depending on the precise sea level at the time. Think about that for a moment. 30 to 60 feet of elevation above the surrounding water, and a wave arriving, depending on the local bathymetry and the wave's approach angle, at potentially comparable or greater heights. There would have been nowhere to run, nowhere higher to go. The wave would not have broken to the shore of those islands and receded in the way a storm wave does. It would have swept entirely across them. The island becomes a shallow obstruction that the water simply passes over, carrying everything on its surface with it. What the tsunami did to the remnant islands of Doggerland can be described with terrible accuracy in a single word. Everything. We do not know how many people were on those islands when a wave came. We will likely never know. The evidence for human habitation of the late Doggerland remnants is fragmentary even by the standards of Mesolithic archaeology. The seabed sediment that covers the Dogger Bank has not been systematically excavated. The cost and the technical difficulty of underwater archaeology at this scale are enormous. What we have is inference and artifact and the occasional extraordinary accident of a trawler net. But we know people were there. The Lehman and Auer banks on the southern edge of the Dogger Bank have yielded Mesolithic artifacts from the right period. The Brown Bank, a submerged ridge in the southern North Sea, has produced worked bone and flint tools consistent with human habitation in exactly this era. There are people in the area. There may well have been communities on the Dogger Hills, those last remnant heights of the lost continent, in the days and weeks before the wave arrived. If there were, they had no warning. Not the hours of warning that modern tsunami detection systems can provide. Not even the minutes of warning that local knowledge of a retreating sea sometimes offers. A warning that traditional coastal communities in some parts of the world have encoded in their knowledge as a sign to run for high ground. On a flat island in a shallow sea, the retreating water and the approaching wall are nearly simultaneous. The interval between recognition and impact is measured not in minutes, but in seconds. It is a mercy of a terrible kind that it would have been fast. In the aftermath of the tsunami, the North Sea coast of Britain was transformed. The wave that had swept inland across the low-lying coastal plains of eastern Scotland and northeastern England deposited its load of marine sediment and then withdrew, as all waves ultimately do. But the withdrawal was not a restoration. The landscape the water left behind was not the landscape that had existed before the wave arrived. Low-lying ground that had been freshwater marsh was now inundated with salt water and covered in marine sediment. The vegetation was destroyed. The topsoil, accumulated over thousands of years, was stripped in some areas and buried under marine deposits in others. River mouths were altered. Tidal channels were redirected. The entire coastal geography of the region had been rearranged in a matter of hours. And for the people who survived, those who had been on higher ground inland, those who had been far enough from the shore to escape the worst of the inundation, the world they returned to was not the world they had left. Their fishing grounds were gone. Their coastal camps were gone. The tidal estuaries where they had harvested shellfish and set their fish traps were unrecognizable, covered in fresh marine sediment, the familiar landmarks buried or destroyed. The routes between settlements that had been walked for generations had been altered by the water. The trees at the coast were dead or gone. The beaches where their boats had been hauled up were covered in debris. And offshore, where the remnant islands had stood, there was now only water. The cultural memory of this event, the question of whether it was remembered and how, and for how long, is one of the most fascinating and most contested aspects of the Doggerland story. It is worth being honest about the limits of what we know here. We do not have written records from Mesolithic Britain. We do not have preserved oral traditions that can be definitively traced back 8,000 years. The connection between the Storegga tsunami and any specific mythological tradition is speculative, intriguing, and cannot be confirmed by the available evidence. What we can say is this: flood myths are among the most widespread narrative traditions in human culture. They appear on every inhabited continent. In Mesopotamia, in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the later Hebrew tradition of Noah, the flood is the defining catastrophe that reshapes the relationship between humanity and the divine. In Greek mythology, Deucalion survives a flood sent by Zeus to destroy a corrupt humanity. In Hindu scripture, the fish avatar of Vishnu warns Manu of a coming flood and guides him to safety. In the Aztec tradition, the fourth world ends in a flood. Among the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, where the geological evidence for catastrophic coastal flooding is strong, flood traditions are embedded deep in the cultural foundation. The universality of these traditions does not, by itself, prove that they are memories of specific events. Floods are common enough in human experience that the motif could arise independently in many cultures without reference to a single primal catastrophe. Honest scholars acknowledge this. But honest scholars also acknowledge that the post-glacial period, the period of Doggerland's destruction, was genuinely one of the most dramatic episodes of coastal flooding in human prehistory. The people who experienced it were cognitively modern. They had language. They had oral tradition. They had, as the Mesolithic burial evidence makes abundantly clear, a rich symbolic and spiritual life in which significant events were marked and remembered. The idea that the memory of the drowning of Doggerland, the greatest land loss in northwestern European prehistory, simply evaporated without trace in the oral traditions of the people who witnessed it, seems, to put it gently, unlikely. It was not the only flood. It was not the last flood. But it was, in the experience of the people of this part of the world, the defining one. The one that ended a world. Whether its echo survives in any tradition we can identify today is a question that may never be definitively answered. But the question itself is worth holding on to, because it reminds us that what we're talking about is not geology. What we're talking about is human experience. People who had names and faces and stories and loves and fears, whose world was taken from them in a way they could not have anticipated and could not have stopped. Their story deserves to be remembered, even if the precise form in which they themselves remembered it is lost to us. The final severing. This is the phrase that researchers and writers have used to describe what the Storegga tsunami meant for the remaining connection between Britain and the European continent. And it is the right phrase. Not the only cause, not the only factor, but the final one. The coup de grace delivered to a landscape already dying by degrees. The English Channel had been forming for thousands of years before the tsunami. The shallow land bridge at its eastern end had been eroding and flooding progressively. By the time the Storegga wave struck, that connection had almost certainly already been broken. Britain was already becoming an island in the south. But in the north, in the shallow waters of the North Sea, the process had been slower. The Dogger Bank and the surrounding low ground had been acting, even in their reduced and partially submerged state, as a kind of loose geographic connection between the British coastline and the coasts of what are now Denmark and the Netherlands. Not a land bridge you could walk across any longer, but a shallow, island-scattered, navigable series of banks and channels that still, in some topographic sense, linked the two sides of what was becoming a sea. The tsunami and the flooding it accelerated ended that connection. In the months and years after the wave, the shallow waters over the remnant Dogger banks deepened as the disturbed sediment resettled. The wave scoured some elevated areas and buried others. The brief, violent reorganization of the North Sea seafloor by the wave and its aftermath pushed the geography of the region further and faster toward its modern form. Britain became definitively and permanently an island, not in a single moment. Geology does not work in single moments, not even in the aftermath of events as dramatic as the Storegga slide. But the tsunami was the event that, in the context of the longer process, sealed the outcome. The slow drowning of Doggerland had been, for thousands of years, a process with no definite endpoint. The tsunami gave it one. The sea closed over the last of the lost land, and the island of Britain, for the first time in its existence, stood alone. There is a scientific detail about the Storegga slide that deserves its own moment, because it connects the ancient event to a world we recognize, and it carries a warning that is not subtle. The destabilization of methane hydrates, those strange frozen compounds in the deep seafloor sediment, the fire ice, which may have contributed to the failure of the Norwegian slope, are not a relic of the past. They are present today in enormous quantities in the seafloor sediments of the Arctic and subarctic seas. The volume of carbon they contain, locked in frozen form, is estimated to be in the same order of magnitude as all other known fossil fuel reserves combined. They are stable for now. As long as the deep ocean water above them remains cold enough, as long as the pressure remains high enough, they hold together. They do not release their gas. They do not destabilize the sediment around them. But the deep ocean is warming. Slowly, silently, without drama. The heat that has been accumulating in the world's oceans as a consequence of the increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases is penetrating downward. Not quickly, not yet to the depths where the most significant hydrate deposits sit, but in the direction of warming, without reversal. The scientists who study submarine landslides and methane hydrate stability do not speak in certainties about future strega-scale events. Science is careful about certainties. But they do speak about the conditions under which past events occurred and about whether those conditions are becoming more or less likely to recur. And the conditions that preceded the Strega slide, warming deep ocean water, destabilizing seafloor sediment, methane hydrates at the edge of their stability field, are conditions that have a direction. They are pointing somewhere. This does not mean another Strega slide is imminent. It may not happen in any time frame that is meaningful to human planning. The science does not support that level of alarm, but it also does not mean it is impossible. And in the context of a story about a lost civilization destroyed by events set in motion by a changing climate, the existence of that mechanism, that chain of cause and effect running from a warming world to a destabilized seafloor to a catastrophic wave, is not a detail that should be passed over quickly. The people of Doggerland did not cause the climate change that set their world on the path to destruction. They had no idea it was happening. They had no concept of the planetary forces arrayed against them. They had no warning system, no scientific infrastructure, no political process by which they might have identified the threat and organized a response. We do not have those excuses. Let us return one final time in this act to the shore. 8,150 years ago. The morning after the tsunami, the northeastern coast of what is now Scotland and what is now the southern North Sea. The wave has come and gone. The water has withdrawn, carrying with it an incalculable weight of debris, of soil and wood and bone and stone and everything that had been on the surface of the land before it arrived. The shoreline is unrecognizable. Where there had been beach and tidal flat and estuary and low coastal forest, there is now a thick layer of gray-brown marine sediment, already drying at its edges in the morning air, smelling of deep water and the dead things it had carried from the sea. The birds have not yet returned. The silence is absolute in the way that a silence after violence is always absolute. A silence of aftermath, of things not yet resumed. There are, somewhere further inland, people who survived. People who are on higher ground, or deep in the forest, or simply far enough from the coast when the wave came that it reached them only as a rush of water through the undergrowth and a wall of sound, and then, as quickly as it had come, a retreat. They are alive. They're uninjured, perhaps, or nearly so, but they're standing in a landscape that has been reorganized around them in a matter of hours, and they're looking toward the sea, and the sea is calm again, glittering in the early light, as though nothing has happened. And out there, where the islands were, there is only water. The hills that some of them had seen on the horizon all their lives. The land that their parents had spoken of as the old world. The place from before, the ground that their grandparents' had walked on as children. The last remnant of the lost continent. It is gone. It is water. There is nothing to see. There is no going back. There was never any going back. But now there is no question about it either. The water has answered it. What they felt, those survivors on the altered shore, we cannot know. Whether they wept or raged, or simply stood in the silence of absolute loss, we cannot know. Whether they had words for what they had witnessed, or whether they stood beyond the reach of words, we cannot know. We know only that they were the last people to live in a world that included the land of Doggerland. That the generation born after them would grow up with no living memory of a time when those hills had been above the water. That within 2 or 3 generations, the lost land would exist only in the stories that the survivors told, and then in the dimming echo of those stories as the years and the generations accumulated and the world moved on. In the space of a single day, a civilization that had taken 10,000 years to build was removed from the map. Not by war, not by famine, not by the failures of the people who had built it, who had been, by any measure, extraordinary in their knowledge and their adaptation and their love of the living world around them. By the earth itself, indifferent and immeasurable and vast, reminding every living thing upon its surface, as it has always reminded them, of the precise terms of their tenancy. The tenancy of Doggerland was over. The sea had collected what it was owed. On a gray Tuesday morning in 1939, a fisherman working out of the port of Lowestoft on the Suffolk coast hauled up his net and found something that did not belong to the sea. It was a piece of peat, dark, dense, compacted, the kind of material you find in bogs in Finland, not on the floor of the North Sea. Embedded in it was a fragment of bone. He turned it over in his hands on the rolling deck, salt water running off it, and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the sea around him. Then he looked at the bone again. He kept it. He was not a scientist. He was not an archaeologist. He was a working fisherman, out on the water in all weathers, earning a living from a sea that had been generous to his family for generations. But he understood, in the way that people who work closely with the physical world often understand things that specialists sometimes miss, that this object was not supposed to be here, that there was a story in it that had not been told. He had no way of knowing how large that story was. The North Sea has been giving up the bones of Doggerland for as long as there have been boats working its banks. Long before the scientists arrived with their theories and their instruments, the fishermen knew. They had been pulling strange objects from the deep for generations. Bones too large for any modern animal. Stones that carried the unmistakable signature of human intention. Pieces of ancient wood, black and dense and impossibly preserved, that crumbled when they dried out, but held their form long enough to suggest that they had once been shaped by a human hand. Most of those objects went back overboard, or ended up on mantelpieces in Suffolk and Norfolk and Yorkshire in the Netherlands, unremarked and unrecorded. The silent accumulation of a lost world, returning to the surface by accident, finding no framework in which its significance could be understood, disappearing back into the ordinary. But some were kept. Some were shown to people who asked the right questions. And slowly, over the course of the 20th century, those isolated objects began to accumulate into something larger than curiosity. They began to accumulate into evidence. The systematic scientific investigation of Doggerland is, in historical terms, extraordinarily recent. For most of the 20th century, the lost land was a theoretical concept. Geologists accepted the idea that the North Sea had once been dry land. Archaeologists acknowledged that Mesolithic artifacts were occasionally dredged from the seabed. But the resources and the technology required to study that lost landscape in any systematic way did not exist. The technology that changed everything came with one of history's characteristic ironies from the oil and gas industry. Beginning in the 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s and 80s, the exploitation of the North Sea's enormous hydrocarbon reserves required an unprecedented mapping of the seabed and the sedimentary layers beneath it. The oil companies needed to know what was down there, not the archaeology, the geology, the structure of the sedimentary layers, the location of the faults and the anticlines that might trap oil and gas. To find out, they developed and deployed three-dimensional seismic survey technology on a scale never previously attempted. The technique works by sending pulses of sound into the seabed and recording the patterns of the returning echoes. Different sediment layers reflect sound differently. The returning echoes carry, encoded in their timing and their amplitude, a detailed record of the subsurface structure. Processed by computer, those echoes can be assembled into a three-dimensional image of the geology beneath the seafloor that is, in its resolution and its detail, nothing short of astonishing. The oil companies used that technology to find petroleum. But what the data also captured, incidentally, was something far older and far more significant than any reservoir of fossil fuel. The buried landscape of Doggerland. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a team of researchers led by Professor Vince Gaffney of what was then the University of Birmingham and later the University of Bradford, obtained access to a portion of the three-dimensional seismic data collected by the oil and gas industry over the southern North Sea. What they did with it was, in archaeological terms, revolutionary. They were not looking for oil. They were looking for rivers. Ancient river channels, cut into the Mesolithic land surface before it was drowned, leave a characteristic signature in seismic data. The erosion of a river into the surrounding sediment creates a structure with distinct acoustic properties. It looks different from the surrounding geology. And once you know what you're looking for, you can trace those channels for miles, following the ancient drainage pattern of a landscape that has not seen the surface for 8,000 years. What Gaffney and his colleagues found exceeded anything they had anticipated. The seismic data revealed not just individual river channels, but an entire ancient landscape, preserved beneath the sediment of the North Sea floor with a completeness that no terrestrial Mesolithic site in Britain or Northern Europe could approach. River valleys and their tributaries, branching and rejoining in patterns immediately recognizable as a drainage network. The outlines of lakes, mapped by the flat reflective surface of their ancient sediment. Salt marsh deposits at the ancient coastline. Estuaries where the rivers had once met the sea. Hills and ridges and valleys. The three-dimensional topography of a landscape frozen in time by the water that had drowned it. For the first time since the Storega tsunami had swept across the remnant of Doggerland 8,150 years before, the shape of the lost land was visible to human eyes. Gaffney's team published their findings in 2007 in a landmark paper that effectively established the modern science of Doggerland research. The map they produced of the ancient landscape was unlike anything that had previously existed. Not the vague outlines and theoretical reconstructions of earlier attempts. A detailed, evidence-based portrait of a real place. Rivers with names, given by the researchers for the first time in 8,000 years. Hills and ridges identified and described. The broad valley that the ancient Rhine had carved across the interior. The gentle rise of the Dogger Hills above the surrounding plain. It was, in the most literal sense, a map of a world that should not have been recoverable. A world that the sea had taken and, for 8,000 years, refused to give back. And now, through the reprocessed data of a survey originally conducted to find oil, it was visible again. The Brown Bank. If there is a single location that concentrates the archaeology of Doggerland into its most vivid and most human form, it is the Brown Bank. A submerged ridge running roughly northeast to southwest in the southern North Sea. Sitting at depths between 50 and 100 feet, the Brown Bank has been known to North Sea fishermen for centuries as a productive but difficult fishing ground. The irregular bottom snags nets. The currents are strong. It is not a comfortable place to work. But the Brown Bank is extraordinary, because the sediment that covers it is thin, thinner than the sediment covering most of the surrounding seabed. And where the sediment is thin, the Mesolithic land surface is close to the present-day seafloor. Close enough, in some places, to be disturbed by the passage of trawl nets across the bottom. This is why the Brown Bank has produced, over the course of a century of inadvertent excavation by fishing trawlers, an almost continuous stream of Mesolithic material. Animal bones, preserved in the waterlogged sediment. Worked flint tools, occasionally still sharp after 8,000 years in the mud. Fish bones and fish traps of woven withies. Fragments of antler and worked wood. Pollen cores that can be analyzed to reconstruct the vegetation of the ancient landscape with extraordinary precision. The Brown Bank was not, in the Mesolithic, a bank or a ridge. It was a river valley, a favored place, it seems, in the landscape of Doggerland. The kind of place that river valleys are always favored places in human settlement. Sheltered from the wind, close to water, rich in fish and game, offering good visibility in both directions along the valley floor. People camped there, repeatedly, over generations. They left the debris of their lives in the sediment of the valley floor. and the valley floor, drowned and sealed and preserved by 8,000 years of cold, dark water, kept what they left behind in a state of preservation that would be the envy of any terrestrial archaeologist. We are only beginning to read what it holds. In 1931, as we have already told, the Colinda harpoon was pulled from the seabed of the southern North Sea. A barbed antler point, over 11,000 years old, found embedded in a block of peat at a depth of 100 feet of water. It was the object that, more than any other single find, made the idea of Doggerland tangible. Real. Not a theoretical reconstruction, but a physical artifact. A thing made by human hands, on land that was now the floor of the sea. It was not the last such discovery. And some of what has followed is more haunting still. Human bones. Over the years, and with increasing frequency as the scientific community has become more alert to the possibility, fragments of human bone have been recovered from the North Sea seabed by dredging and trawling operations. A frontal bone of a human skull, recovered from the southern North Sea and known informally among researchers as the Tilbury skull, though that name has a complicated provenance. Fragments of long bone. Occasional teeth. Small, dark, dense with the mineral replacement that occurs in bone preserved for thousands of years in waterlogged sediment. Each one of these fragments represents a person, not a statistic, not an archaeological category. A person who was born and grew up and lived their life on the ground that is now the floor of the North Sea, who had a family and a language and a relationship with the landscape around them that was as intimate and as defining as our relationships with the places we call home, who died, as all people die, and was placed in the earth by people who love them, and who now, 8,000 years later, after a journey neither they nor their mourners could have imagined, finds themselves brought back to the surface for a moment, held in someone's hands, studied, measured, sampled for ancient DNA, and then, most likely, placed in a museum drawer or reanalyzed or discussed at an academic conference in a fluorescent-lit room a long way from the North Sea. It is not the homecoming they would have wished for, but it is a homecoming of kind, a reunion between the present and the unimaginably deep past, a moment in which the chain of time that connects us to them becomes, briefly, visible. The ancient DNA revolution has transformed what we can know about the people of Doggerland, even from the fragmentary evidence available. Beginning in the second decade of this century, advances in the extraction and analysis of ancient genetic material from prehistoric human remains have opened windows into the past that previous generations of researchers could not have dreamed of. The techniques developed by pioneers, including Professor Svana Pabo, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for his work in this field, allow researchers to extract, sequence, and analyze genetic material from bones thousands of years old, even from bones that have been subjected to the kind of harsh preservational conditions typical of North Sea sediment. What the ancient DNA of Mesolithic northwestern Europeans tells us is, as we touched on in the second act of this story, remarkable. The Western hunter-gatherers who lived in and around Doggerland during its final millennia were genetically distinct from the farmers who would later arrive from Anatolia and transform the demographics of Europe. They were tall, with a genetic predisposition toward dark pigmentation in skin and hair, alongside a striking prevalence of light-colored eyes, particularly blue. They were, in the language of modern genetics, a population that had been relatively isolated in northwestern Europe for thousands of years, adapting to the cold and wet and the particular demands of the post-glacial landscape. And their genetic legacy did not vanish when Doggerland drowned. It persisted, diluted over thousands of years by the arrival of farmers and later of Bronze Age migrants from the Eurasian steppe. But persistent, traceable, present in attenuated form in the genomes of people living in the British Isles and Scandinavia today. You may carry it yourself. The person sitting next to you almost certainly does, if they have any ancestry from the British Isles or Northern Europe. The people of Doggerland are not entirely gone. They are distributed thinly but really through the genetic inheritance of tens of millions of living people. Their blood, in the most literal biological sense, is still here. The land drowned. The people adapted, migrated, and survived, and their descendants are reading these words. The future of Doggerland archaeology is one of the most exciting frontiers in the study of human prehistory. And it is a frontier that is only now, with the convergence of several technologies and disciplines, becoming genuinely accessible. Underwater archaeology has historically been expensive, technically demanding, and limited in its scope. The logistics of working on the seafloor at depths that are too deep for conventional diving, but too shallow for some deep-water remotely operated vehicles, in the turbid, tide-swept waters of the North Sea, have constrained what researchers could do. What they wanted to do, and what they knew the evidence could support, was always considerably more ambitious than what was practically achievable. That is changing. Autonomous underwater vehicles, essentially robotic submarines capable of operating independently for hours or days at a time, have become dramatically more capable and more affordable in the past decade. Equipped with high-resolution multi-beam sonar, sub-bottom profilers, and underwater cameras, they can map the seafloor and the shallow sedimentary layers beneath it in extraordinary detail, identifying buried archaeological features with a precision that was unimaginable even 20 years ago. Side-scan sonar technology has advanced to the point where detailed images of the seabed surface can be produced from survey vessels without any direct contact with the bottom. The outlines of ancient features, buried only shallowly under the modern seafloor, can sometimes be detected in these images. Fish traps, wooden structures, the subtle topographic variations that mark the location of ancient campsites. Sediment coring, the extraction of long cylinders of seabed sediment for laboratory analysis, has become more targeted and more informative as the three-dimensional seismic data has improved. Researchers can now select coring locations with a precision that maximizes the chance of encountering the ancient land surface at the right depth, in conditions likely to preserve organic material. The coming decades of Doggerland research will, in all probability, transform our understanding of Mesolithic northwestern Europe in ways that the current evidence only hints at. The potential for the recovery of ancient DNA from human and animal remains, for the radiocarbon dating of organic material in buried contexts, for the reconstruction of the ancient climate and vegetation from pollen and plant macrofossils in peat deposits, is enormous. The evidence is down there. The tools to recover and interpret are rapidly improving. Doggerland is not a closed book. It is a book that is only now, 8,000 years after the sea closed over its last page, beginning to be read. But let us step back from the science for a moment. Let us step back from the data and the surveys and the ancient DNA and the sediment cores and look at the larger picture that this story is painting. Because there's a question that this documentary has been circling since its opening moments. A question that the story of Doggerland raises with a force that no amount of scientific framing can entirely contain. And it deserves to be asked directly. What does this mean for us? We are living, right now, in a period of climate change. Not as dramatic, not yet, as the post-glacial warming that drowned Doggerland. The rate of change we are currently experiencing is, on geological timescales, exceptional but not unprecedented. The Earth has been through worse. It has been through the Balling-Allarod warming. It has been through the Younger Dryas reversal. It has been through meltwater pulses that raise sea levels by 60 feet in a century. The Earth, in other words, has survived everything that has happened to it. The Earth will survive what is happening to it now. But the Earth is not the thing that needs our attention. The people are the thing that needs our attention. Sea levels are rising. The most recent assessments from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change project a global mean sea level rise of somewhere between 1 and 3 feet by the year 2100, under a range of emission scenarios. At the higher end of the uncertainty range, accounting for the possibility of more rapid ice sheet loss than the central estimates assume, the figures are larger, potentially much larger. 1 to 3 feet does not sound like Doggerland. It does not sound like the 360 feet of sea level rise that occurred between the last glacial maximum and the present. And it is not. We are not facing an imminent return to the conditions of the early post-glacial. Let's be clear about that. but 1 to 3 feet of sea level rise, distributed unevenly around the world's coastlines and combined with the increased frequency and intensity of coastal storm surge that a warmer atmosphere generates, is not a trivial consequence for human civilization. The populations at risk are enormous. More than 600 million people currently live in low-lying coastal zones less than 30 feet above sea level. The megacities of the coast, Miami and Mumbai, Shanghai and Lagos, Amsterdam and Dhaka, Bangkok and Jakarta, are sitting at elevations that the geologically recent past has demonstrated can be erased by changes in sea level that are, in the context of Earth history, quite modest. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, is sinking at the same time as the sea around it rises, a combination of natural subsidence and groundwater extraction that makes it one of the fastest disappearing major cities on Earth. The Indonesian government has already committed to relocating its capital to higher ground. They are doing, in the early 21st century, what the people of Doggerland did 8,000 years ago, moving inland, because the water is coming. The people of the Maldives, whose islands rise only a few feet above sea level at their highest points, are conducting a national conversation about the potential evacuation of their entire country. Not in panic, not in crisis, in the considered, painful, long-horizon planning of a people who can see what is coming and are trying to decide what to do about it before the choice is made for them. These are not ancient stories. They are tomorrow's news. There is something that the story of Doggerland offers us that no amount of sea level projection data or emissions scenario modeling can provide. Something more fundamental than facts, though, that is grounded in facts. It is perspective. The human experience of climate-driven land loss is not new. It is not a modern invention or a modern problem. It is as old as the species itself. We have been losing land to the sea and adapting to that loss and grieving that loss and surviving that loss for as long as we have been anatomically modern humans living on coastlines in a world whose climate does not remain constant. The people of Doggerland were not the first to experience this, and they were not the last. The history of post-glacial Europe is, in significant part, a history of human communities learning to live with a retreating shoreline, of cultures adapting their technology, their settlement patterns, their social structures, their stories, to the reality of a world that was being continuously renegotiated by the movement of water. And they survived. Not Doggerland itself. Doggerland did not survive. The land is gone and it is not coming back, not in any time frame that has meaning for our species. But the people survived. They were displaced and they grieved and they adapted and they rebuilt their lives on higher ground. And their descendants went on to build the cultures that would eventually produce agriculture, metalworking, writing, cities, science, and every other thing that we call civilization. The resilience of the human species in the face of climate disruption is not a theoretical proposition. It is a demonstrated historical fact. We know it is possible to survive these transitions because our existence is proof that our ancestors did. But that resilience was not passive. It was not the resilience of simply waiting for the worst to pass. It was the resilience of adaptation, of movement, of the willingness to let go of what could not be saved and invest energy in what could. The people who survived the drowning of Doggerland were the ones who moved when moving was still possible, who read the slow signs of the rising water and chose, generation by generation, to stay ahead of it rather than wait for it to arrive. The ones who waited too long did not leave descendants. There is a sandbar in the southern North Sea called the Doggerbank. You will not find it on most maps, unless you are looking at a chart for navigation or a bathymetric survey. It lies roughly 100 miles east of the Yorkshire coast, and at its shallowest it rises to within 45 feet of the surface. It is one of the finest fishing grounds in the North Sea, rich in cod and haddock and plaice, and it has been fished commercially for centuries. It is also, as you now know, the remnant peak of the Dogger Hills, the highest surviving point of a landscape that once stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The place where the last above-water ground of Doggerland held on, decades or centuries after everything around it had flooded, before the sea finally covered it too. Fishing vessels cross it every day. Their hulls pass over the buried ridges and valleys of the ancient landscape. Their anchors, when they set them, bite into sediment that rests on top of a world that was alive with human activity 8,000 years ago. The fishermen who work those grounds are, in the most tangible sense, working on the roof of a lost civilization. Most of them know, vaguely, that there was once land there, that the North Sea was not always a sea. It is a piece of knowledge that the fishing communities of this part of the world have carried for generations, passed down alongside the practical knowledge of where the fish run and how to read the weather. A folk memory of a kind, stripped of its specific content by thousands of years of retelling, but still present. Still there. We are all, in some sense, in that position, passing over a lost world, aware in some vague and unexamined way that the ground beneath our feet has a history deeper than we can easily imagine, carrying forward the inheritance of people whose names we do not know and whose faces we cannot see. The difference, now, is that we have the tools to look more closely, to see what is down there, to recover, piece by piece and bone by bone and pollen core by pollen core, the shape of the world that was taken. Let us go back to the North Sea. One last time. It is a gray day. The kind of day the North Sea specializes in. The sky and the water the same flat, pewter color, the horizon a barely visible line between two shades of the same indifference. The wind comes from the northeast, carrying cold and salt. The surface of the water is not rough, but it is not still. It is restless, in the way the North Sea is always restless, as if something beneath it is not entirely at peace. Somewhere below this water, perhaps 60, perhaps 80, perhaps 120 feet down, is the floor of a world. Not the metaphorical floor of a world. The actual, physical, geological floor of a place where people lived. Where a mother once shelled hazelnuts by a fire, while her children played at the edge of a river that no longer runs to any sea. Where a hunter once stood on a low ridge in the gray morning light and watched a red deer moving through the mist below him, and felt, in that moment, the particular silence that settles when the world holds its breath before an action. Where someone, whose name is gone as thoroughly as if it had never existed, once looked up at a sky very much like this one and felt, in whatever language their mind worked in, something that in our language we might call wonder. That person is gone. That river is gone. That silence is gone. The world that held all of them is gone, drowned in the cold, dark water of a sea that did not ask their permission and did not wait for their readiness. But they were real as you are, as real as the ground under your feet and the air in your lungs and the light on your face right now. And their story, the story of the land that was lost and the people who loved it and the climate that took it, is not finished. Because the forces that ended their world, the forces of a changing climate, of rising seas, of the indifference of geological process to human attachment and human meaning, are not forces that belong to the past. They are forces that belong to all time. They are forces that are operating right now, in the present, at this exact moment, as you listen to these words. Doggerland is not a cautionary tale in the sense of a story with a simple moral that a character failed to learn. It is something more complicated and more honest than that. It is a record, an evidence-based, geologically confirmed, archaeologically documented record of what happens when the climate changes and the sea rises and the land goes under, of what is lost when a world drowns, of what survives and at what cost and in what form. It is a record that we have only recently learned to read. And the timing of our learning to read it, at this precise moment in human history, at this exact junction of scientific capability and climatic urgency, does not feel like a coincidence. It feels like something finding its moment. The light is failing over the North Sea, the pewter sky darkening toward the horizon, the fishing boats heading in, the wind picking up, as it always does, toward evening on this particular stretch of water, carrying with it the cold of the north and the smell of deep ocean. Beneath the surface, in the dark, the world of Doggerland lies, as it has lain for 8,000 years. Patient in the way that only the truly lost can be patient. Waiting, without waiting, to be found. Its rivers are down there, still tracing their ancient paths through the sediment. Its forests are down there, compressed and blackened, but still identifiable in the peat. Its hearths are down there, the scattered charcoal of fires that burned 10,000 years ago, still recoverable from the mud. Its people are down there, or some of them are, sleeping in the ground that was once their world, in the silence of the deep water, waiting for the net or the coring device or the camera of an autonomous vehicle to find them and bring them, briefly, back to the light. They deserve to be found. They deserve to be known. They deserve to have their world restored to the map of human history, not as a footnote or a curiosity, but as what it was. A civilization, a culture, a people who loved a place and built their lives in it and lost it, not through any failure of their own, but through the vast, indifferent turning of the world. Their story is one of the great stories of our species, and it has been sitting at the bottom of the North Sea, waiting for us to have the tools and the wisdom to recover it for 8,000 years. We are only beginning. If this story has moved you, if it has changed the way you see the gray expanse of the North Sea or the map of Europe on the wall or the ground beneath your feet, then pass it on. Share it with someone who has never heard of Doggerland, who does not yet know that the world they think they know is a snapshot of right now, and that right now is a very thin slice of a very long story. And if you want to follow where this story leads, to stay with the archaeology and the science and the ongoing recovery of the drowned world, then subscribe. Stay with us. There is more to find. There is always more to find, because the sea has kept its secrets for a very long time. And we're just beginning to ask the right questions. Somewhere in the North Sea tonight, a fishing boat is crossing the Dogger Bank. Its lights are small against the dark water. Its engines are a low vibration in the cold air. The crew are below, or on watch, doing the ordinary things that people on boats do at night. Not thinking about the ground 60 feet below their keel. Not thinking about the world that is down there, sealed in the mud, intact and invisible and extraordinary. The boat passes over. The water closes behind it. And in the dark below, undisturbed, the lost world waits. It has waited 8,000 years. It can wait a little longer.